welcome to Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis Undiano. Our guest today is the acclaimed novelist Maaza Mengiste. She has received high praise for her first novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, and we are so happy to have her on the show today. Maaza, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you.
Could you take us back to a moment where, in your mind, you became a writer? Maybe a moment where you sort of committed yourself to being on that writing journey throughout your life?
Yeah, so I was in Los Angeles. I was living in LA at the time, trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. I was in a job that I hated.
How old were you?
Oh, now you're really asking tough questions. I was, let's see, it was probably 2002, 31.
Okay.
Maybe 31, 32. And I was in a job that I thought was going to be a dream job, and it ended up completely the opposite. I didn't know what I would do with my life at that point. I just had a sense that I wanted to write, but I didn't have an active writing life. I wasn't one of those people writing short stories, sending them off. I had not done a short story before. But I had this thought of a book about the revolution in Ethiopia because it had affected and impacted my life and so many people I knew. But it seemed like such a huge and unwieldy topic. But one day, it was a Sunday, and I remember sitting by the window and the sun was coming in, that sunny LA weather, and I opened up the LA Times and opened to a page that featured an article that was about the 25th anniversary of the fall of the military junta in Argentina, the 25th anniversary of the end of the dirty wars. But what the journalist had done with this history that was very similar to the revolution in Ethiopia, with that in terms of violence, he had decided to focus on the students that were impacted, the classmates that were left from all these other high school or college students that had disappeared or were killed, and also the mothers of those students. And he had photographs of these women holding up their own photographs of their son or daughter who had disappeared or had been killed. And looking at that, I saw Ethiopians, because I knew that Ethiopians, we had mothers holding up those same photographs of their own disappeared or killed sons and daughters. We had those class pictures where you could X out how many people were no longer alive. We had those classmates that now could continue to talk as survivors of what happened. And what this journalist had done that I thought was for me a moment of an epiphany, he had taken this historical event and narrowed it down to human beings, to human lives.
So you really discovered your desire to write and your topic, your subject, all at the same time.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I knew I wanted to write about the revolution, but how do you do that? And you do it through the people impacted.
Now, had there been somebody maybe before that, when you were a lot younger, who sort of drew you towards writing? It was a role model, or was there a writer that you particularly loved, and you were always going back to that writer? Is anything like that back there for you?
Well, I'll go even further back than my reading life and say that in Ethiopia and in Nigeria where I lived, and in Kenya also where I lived, my parents are probably some of the most charismatic and energetic storytellers I've ever encountered. My dad is the life of the party. When he starts talking, the entire party just gravitates, and even my friends will come sit around him and they die laughing, even to this day. If he's there, he steals the show. And my mother is the same way. So I grew up listening to ways to tell a story. I'm not a good storyteller like them verbally, but I think I picked up on how these stories can be entertaining.
Did you, once you realized that you wanted to write and it was going to be about Ethiopia, did you fight that at all? Were there other topics that you tried to write about and you just ended up back in the same place, needing to write about Ethiopia?
I think I did, yes. One of the things I thought I would do, I used to live in Michigan and I used to live in Detroit, and I was really involved in the art scene in Detroit. So my friends were DJs, they were jazz musicians, they were visual artists, they were photographers. And I thought, well, I don't know enough about a revolution, but maybe I can write about a jazz band. So I would follow my friends who were jazz musicians and sit in on the rehearsals. I did a short film about jazz musicians, and I thought that was what I actually was going to do. And this story about Ethiopia kept coming up.
It had to be told.
It wouldn't leave me alone at all.
You know, there's such a strong tradition of writers writing in exile. For one reason or another, they're someplace else rather than their own country, and maybe they reclaim it a little bit. Do you think of yourself as a writer in exile?
No. You know why? I feel like I'm an American as much as anything else. That I'm not in exile from Ethiopia. I've made this country my home as much as anything else, and English is mine now. I claimed it when I was young, and I kind of took it over and made it work for me. So I don't feel that sense of being somewhere where I'm not quite comfortable looking somewhere else.
Would you ever think of writing in Amharic, the language of Ethiopia?
I left before I was learning to write efficiently in that, and so really English has been the language that I learned in and read.
How are writers regarded in Ethiopia? How have your parents, how did they respond to this choice you made?
Well, now they're okay. Now they're okay with it. But when I was first starting out to be, I hope they never see this show because now they're going to find out everything. But when I went into college, my intent was pre-med, because every Ethiopian parent wants their child to be a doctor. That's the thing.
That's the top of the ladder.
That's the top. So from the age of 5, my parents at a dinner party would say, "What do you want to be? Tell them what you want to be." And I would say, "A doctor." So that's what I grew up with. And I went into school and realized that, oh, I really love to read. I can actually do this, whereas if I take chemistry next semester, I'll probably flunk out.
So you were trying to do the pre-med
Well,
thing,
I was trying.
and it just
was not going to. It was not going to work. But I didn't know what to do, because I knew that my family had made so many sacrifices for me to go to school and for me to be in college, that if I decided at that point to kind of go against what they had lived their whole life to working for, it was going to be devastating for them.
It's a lot of pressure.
It's a lot of pressure on me.
Yeah.
So what I did, when it was time to declare my major, very quietly, without saying anything to them, I signed up to be a political science major, so that when they called me and asked me what I was studying, without lying to them, I could say, "Oh, you know, some kind of science." And it worked for a while. They didn't question anything, but then I didn't like poli-sci at all. And I said, "Oh, what am I going to do?" And I just decided to just switch my major, do English, and that was probably one of the biggest fights I've ever had with my parents.
How are writers regarded in Ethiopia? Are they professionals, or?
Not at all. I mean, writers are considered the bottom of the totem pole. Maybe singers are right down there. We're right at the bottom. It's just not. It's not respected. So
this was a shock to them.
It's a complete shock. My father said, "But you know English. Why do you take it?" And my mother, couldn't you just try law? Couldn't you be a lawyer? They would settle for that, but it was really, they were uncomfortable with the whole thing until they finally saw the book, but that was years in coming. So they were just quietly uncomfortable.
How did they respond now? Because you're I think it's fair to say, on the cutting edge of what's happening in the world of writing, and your book is read around the world, and everybody's waiting for your next book and your success. Do they focus on that? Does that really come across to them at this point?
They're really happy now. They're really happy because my mother lost some family members during the revolution, and it's something that she doesn't talk about very much. But the book has given us an excuse to sit down and begin to unearth some of that. And so I'm still learning about all of this as I'm going through. But in that way, it's been for her kind of a relief, kind of painful, but they've been proud at the same
Are you
time.
saying that there was a lot of sort of hidden trauma that came out of the late 70s in Ethiopia, and people are still trying to maybe connect with that material and understand it?
Yes, it's still coming out. It hasn't fully come out. A lot of students, Ethiopian American students, young people who were born here from those parents who were college age and had to flee Ethiopia during the revolution, who have children here. Those children have contacted me or have come to my readings, and they've told me that they still can't speak to their parents about what happened. Their parents still refuse to say anything, but now that they've read the book, I think one student wrote me and said, now at least I know the questions to ask my dad or the questions to ask my mom.
And maybe a little bit of an emotional map where it's not so terribly overwhelming for people once they've read your book about that period.
Yes, I had another interesting experience with an older gentleman who came and he bought my book. He had read it. He came to my reading, and he said, everything your character Dawit did, I did exactly. And he said, now I'm going to give this book to my sons so they finally understand their father.
Wow.
And it was really, I get those types of stories.
Now, did that happen in Ethiopia or in the U.S.?
Here.
Okay. But he was Ethiopian?
Yes.
Yeah. So your novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, came out in 2010. It's much acclaimed. People have loved it around the world. Why did you focus on this period in the late 70s for this book?
It was what I remembered. It was, they weren't necessarily the earliest memories that I had. The earliest memories were of Ethiopia, when I think of Ethiopia, have all been centered on family, on birthday parties, on visits to friends, on picnics, things like that. But these were probably the most vivid memories that I had that were things I couldn't quite figure out. What did it mean that soldiers broke into our house? What did it mean that people were afraid to talk at the dinner table? What did it mean that we go to a dinner party and there are soldiers stationed, on street corners?
So this is the period in the late 70s. It's after Haile Selassie's reign, and there's been a revolution, but the government itself is now oppressed. The Derg, is that how you say it? In the late 70s.
Yes.
There's a sort of new oppression coming from
Yes.
the military that took over.
Yes, and it at first students, high school students, these educated elite in many ways felt that there was hope, even with the military possibly being on their side, that there was hope to make change. But the ideals of the revolution were co-opted by the military, and those people who were revolutionary started to be labeled counter-revolutionary by that government. And that began this really bloody period of the military trying to stamp out opposition.
And it lasts about, what, about 6 years?
Well, the dictator Mengistu did not leave until 91.
Okay.
But the bloodiest periods of that revolution, called the Red Terror, were somewhere either through 76, 77 to 78. Those were the horrible years.
Would you read us the first couple of paragraphs of the book just to give us a sense of it, a flavor of
Sure.
what it is?
Sure. A thin blue vein pulsed in the collecting pool of blood where a bullet had lodged deep in the boy's back. Hailu was sweating under the heat from the bright operating room lights. There was pressure behind his eyes. He leaned his head to one side, and a nurse's ready hand wiped sweat from his brow. He looked back at his scalpel, the shimmering blood and torn tissues, and tried to imagine the fervor that had led this boy to believe he was stronger than Emperor Haile Selassie's highly trained police. This boy had come in shivering and soaked in his own blood, in the latest American-style jeans with wide legs, and now he wasn't moving. His mother's screams hadn't stopped. Hailu could still hear her just beyond those doors, standing in the hallway. More doors led outside to an ongoing struggle between students and police. Soon, more injured students would fill the emergency rooms, and this work would begin all over again. how old was this boy?
Wow, thank you. That's very nice.
Thank you.
How did you pick the main character for this? Hailu, he's a doctor. He has a family, somebody successful,
Yeah.
maybe a little affluent.
Yes. At first, I was going to. The main character would. There was a rotating cast of main characters. Initially, I had a little girl because that was something I thought I could relate to. Then I had Sarah, who was the mother of the little girl. Then I had Dawit, who became the revolutionary. But Hailu was always in the background, always standing there. And the more scenes I wrote, the more I kept gravitating to how does a doctor deal with the physical consequences of a revolution, of conflict? How does a doctor deal with the moral obligation to heal in a time of war? And I started moving towards him more and more. And in terms of middle class, I think by American standards, the family would probably not be middle class at all. But by Ethiopian standards, he was. And it was kind of a life that I knew, being not rich,
Right.
but not at a poverty level, being comfortable.
From an Ethiopian perspective, it must be shocking to see what happens to this doctor, because I was thinking about your comment a few moments ago that doctors are at the top of the ladder in that culture. So if this family is vulnerable during this period to these inhumanities, torture, and so on, that's got to be really shocking.
Yes, I think for Hailu, I believe that he felt that being a doctor, having delivered the babies of these men who were going to arrest him, might have given him some type of immunity.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Might have given him some immunity. And you know, he finds out that just like everyone else, he's completely stripped of his humanity in this type of situation.
You depict some rough scenes. There's torture and other things in this book. Was it difficult to decide how much of that to put in? Because I know you wanted a kind of forceful rendering of what really happened in this period. How was that, dealing with the torture scenes?
At first I didn't write the book planning on putting anything like that in there. I think my main intent in here is to tell what happened, to tell what happened to these characters. And I initially had written several drafts of the book without these scenes, and then I looked back at it and I said, if I tell what happened, I have to be honest as much as I can and do. If I know this happened, then I need to render it in some way. And also, when I was writing this book, my country, meaning America, was in a war with Iraq and was in a war with Afghanistan, and the news that I was seeing on TV and hearing on the radios was very much what was happening in Ethiopia, what happened in prisons. And how could I look away from this when I was being confronted in daily life with it continuing on?
I noticed too that there's a real, maybe the word is compassion for your characters, sometimes even bad people.
Yeah.
We see them trying to communicate, and you never turn anybody into a monster.
Yeah.
And somebody could argue maybe would deserve to have to be presented in a very negative way, but you don't do that at all. Was that of interest to you, the sort of generation of a kind of compassion in general for the characters, all of the characters caught in this very difficult time and difficult circumstances?
You know, I was really influenced by a 1960 speech by Albert Camus that's titled Create Dangerously. And in there he speaks about the role of the writer in condemning or justifying certain political figures or political acts or moments of evil or good. And he makes a comment that I found really profound, that the role of the writer is to write without judgment, that we are to sit at the feet of both good and evil and simply write. And it made a difference because I may have my own opinions about some of these people involved in the revolution, the really evil people, but my job as a writer is to seek understanding rather than condemnation.
I think that really works wonderfully in this book, and there's I think a kind of message that readers are not going to miss, that you're compassionate towards the characters. And I think the comment maybe then is that it's compassion that has kind of opened up some really ugly things in the book. It's the lack of compassion to begin with.
Yeah.
And if that can go back in place, then people can sort of rehumanize, reset as moral beings.
Yeah, well, you know, and what happens when a country is in civil war, or when conflict is so close to home, you realize that you have family members that are on both sides of this war, of the conflict, and how do you negotiate that? And I think it's happening everywhere, you know, around the world, and it happened in Ethiopia. And so my interest is not in condemning, but understanding how I could sit across the table from someone who was part of this regime that affected so many of my family members, and sit at a wedding and there's someone right there. And that happens all the time.
What if somebody said to you that they understood all of that and it was very effective for them, and they therefore saw this book as a kind of social activism, in the sense that you're trying to reinstitute a sense of compassion about a very difficult period where maybe sometimes compassion was what was lacking?
Yeah.
Would you accept that sort of label as social activist, or is that too far away from what a writer does?
Yeah, I feel like I wanted to tell a story that would help me understand the world at that moment that I remembered. In terms of social activism, that I get wary about that, because what seems to imply is an act of resistance against something. Mm-hmm. It's a fight against something. But what happens when that thing is no longer there? Then who are you? How do you define yourself if you're constantly writing in resistance? And for me, the point is to write, and if it's in the name of compassion, I'll take that.
So if you're not centered within your own humanity,
absolutely,
you're sort of lost anyway, and
absolutely,
you're depending on an outside force
absolutely,
to define your position.
Yeah, and I like to say it's about love in the purest sense of the word, that if you don't have that as a writer, you will be swimming in kind of lost in waters.
You're talking about treating these characters and looking at these characters through a kind of lens of love.
Yeah.
Perfect segue over to Girl Rising.
Oh, okay.
How did you get involved in this movie? This is a project that launched this movie in March of 2013,
yeah,
and it's still being seen around the country. How did you get involved in it?
You know, I got an email one day. I was living in Rome at the time, and this email popped up from Richard, the director, saying, "Hey, I've been trying to track you down, and would you be interested in this project that targets girls' education? And you would be one of the writers, and we'd like to go to different countries and pair girls with women from their own country. And we have several issues, but forced early marriage is one of them in Ethiopia. Any interest?" And at first I said, you know, I lived in LA, so I know how projects come and go, and I wasn't sure if it would happen or not. I was interested in doing something, but I was also wary about the charity in Ethiopia, and I don't want to participate in anything that depicts Ethiopia as another begging hand, because those are not the people that I have seen or known or met. But I spoke with Richard some more and the producers and really thought about it, and it was a fantastic project, and I loved their approach of selecting. They were interested in girls who were already making changes in their life, who had already braved a system and bucked tradition. And they wanted to feature them, not as a helping hand, but young girls who were doing what some adults might be frightened to do.
So the idea was to tell the story of 10 girls, initially. I think they did 9.
Yes.
And then have a writer from the country of each girl tell her story.
Yes.
And then really, I guess there's a larger point about empowerment of people generally through getting an education for girls. That's really And
I really, growing up and being one of the first women in my family, I maybe the first one to graduate from college. I am the first. It was something I truly believed in, and my mother, who didn't have that opportunity, I understood finally as an adult why she pushed education so much for me. She was adamant that that was the priority, no matter anything else I did. And it made sense now, understanding that history in Ethiopia.
They do such a good job. I've seen this film, of course. They look at hunger and disease and violence, and there's some discussion of human trafficking and so on and so forth. And I guess the idea is that instead of feeling helpless, if you just be part of getting one girl educated, you really address all of those problems.
Yes.
There's a a kind of solution, really, in education of women.
Yes, I think, and helping one girl affects a generation. It affects her children. It affects the women she's in contact with, the young girls she's in contact with in her family, in her village, in her school. And I saw that ripple effect with Asmara, and I'm still seeing it now.
Asmara?
Yes.
How did you choose the girl that you worked with?
The crew for 10 times 10 had gone to Ethiopia and interviewed, I don't know how many young girls who had all said no to early marriage, and sent me 5 of those they thought were the best, 4 or 5. And then I was told to pick one. And it was probably one of the hardest parts of this whole project, trying to figure that out. And now I know in hindsight that they had apparently placed bets on who I might pick, and they had their own favorite. But I surprised them all and picked one that they never would have thought, and that was Asmara.
Why would they not pick her? Why would they not think of her?
For a director and a producer, I think she was a nightmare, because she can't speak. She's so shy. She couldn't look in the camera. I could barely hear her voice sometimes. And if you asked her a question, she'd turn away and smile and duck her head. And you know, that's not what a producer wants. That's not what a director wants. But as a writer, I said, there's something, how could she say no? If she can say no, there's a story there. Because these other girls, who were some younger than her, were amazing. They were forthright. They had negotiated with their parents. They were going to take their parents to court. They had set a deal with their parents. They had done these things, and were very happy talking about it on screen, but not her. And I picked her. And there was, I sent an email telling the directors and the producers my decision, and there was a moment of silence on email. And then they finally came back and said, well, that's not who we would have chosen, but it's great. And when I went now at that point to visit Asmara and her family, there was a story there that none of us had expected, and it was amazing.
The story is beautiful, and she's beautiful. Have you had contact with her since then?
I have kept in touch with her through World Vision, who is in that area, and I know she's in school. She is actively studying, doing work. Her mother encourages her, and what's happening is that, you know, I now have good faith that her cousin, she had a small cousin, a girl, she's going to go to school. And so you see that a new kind of tradition start.
Maaza, we are out of time. I wish we had 2
wow.
hours. It just zipped by way too quickly.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for being here
Thank
and sharing
you.
your work with us.
Thank you, RC. It's been a pleasure.
That's all for today's show. I'm so glad that you could join us for this discussion with Maaza Mengiste. We'll see you next time. Thank you for watching.